1492, Columbus's first voyage. 1498, Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Good Hope and reaches India. In just 6 years, the world again is interconnected for the first time in 10,000 years. Where does Salvador come into this story? It comes in soon thereafter, because just after Vasco da Gama's voyage, more Portuguese exploration continued, and 2 years later, a navigator, Pedro Álvares Cabral, went to repeat Vasco da Gama's voyage, but sailed further west. And it is suggested that perhaps he knew that by sailing further west across the equator, there would be a landmass there, or perhaps it was fortuitous that on his way around the Cape of Good Hope, he happened upon the landmass that we now call Brazil and the South American continent. Pedro Álvares Cabral made landfall about 700 kilometers south of where we are standing right now. And he then continued after discovering this new landmass. He wasn't sure whether it was an island or a continent, but he suspected that it might be a continent. He did something absolutely incredible. He then headed for the Cape of Good Hope, rounded the southern tip of Africa, made landfall in Mozambique, many adventures, some disasters, some attacks along the way, and then made his way to the southwest coast of India. Places that we now know as Cochin and Goa became the beginnings of the Portuguese Empire in India. Then he returned, sailed back across the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and arrived back in Portugal. And what he had done, the first human being in history, is he had been in 4 continents on one voyage, starting in Europe, reaching the Americas, stopping in Africa, reaching Asia. And so the world was truly united. And this became, of course, Cabral's voyage, the basis of Portugal's empire in the New World. There were small settlements that were started in the succeeding years. Some failed. So it was really several decades later that a permanent settlement was established here in Salvador. It's notable that the year after Cabral arrived here, another explorer whose name we know well, but don't necessarily know the explorer as well, Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator, explorer, and geographer, took a voyage again to this region, and on November 1st, 1502, discovered the bay just over that way, just over my shoulder. Now, what is November 1st? That is All Saints' Day, and that is the Bay of All Saints, named by Amerigo Vespucci. But of course, America is named after Amerigo Vespucci. And so here we are in the Americas. Here we are standing next to the Bay of All Saints, discovered on All Saints' Day, 1502. In 1549, this city was established as the capital of Portugal's empire in the Americas, and specifically in Brazil. Now, we should also recall one other basic political fact of the day. Even before Vasco da Gama's voyage, but just after Columbus's voyage of discovery, the rivalry between Spain and Portugal led to a clash. Who was going to control these lands? and they began intensive negotiations in 1493. And in 1494, they established a treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was later sanctified by the Pope, which divided the world between the two kingdoms, the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of Portugal. And a line was drawn, divided the Western Hemisphere so that west of that line would all be Spanish possessions, and east of that line would be Portuguese possessions. Brazil, being on the east of South America, became the Portuguese possessions, and the countries to the west of South America became the Spanish possessions. Incidentally, the other countries in the world, the other kingdoms like France and Britain, the Republic of Holland, they weren't too impressed with the Treaty of Tordesillas. They said, who gave these two countries the right to divide the world? So it ended up that it wasn't just Portugal and Spain that divided the world. And incidentally, with the line drawn several decades later on the other side of the world, so that the Philippines, named after Philip II of Spain, would be Spanish, and the possessions on the other side of that line would be Portuguese. Well, other parts of Western Europe that were also rapidly developing their navigational and military capacity said, we don't play with the Treaty of Tordesillas. And of course, in the end, the Western Hemisphere was colonized. It was the imperial possessions of many of the European powers of the day. 1549, this became the seat of Portugal in Brazil, in Portuguese America. It remained the seat of Portugal for another 2 centuries, after which Rio de Janeiro became the capital of Brazil for reasons that we know, with the rise of mining, the rise of coffee production, the shift of the economy to the southeast of where we are today. But for 2 centuries, this was the capital. These events of joining the world together, without question, constitute one of the pivotal moments of all of human history. And I'd like to share with you some of the remarkable lines, observations written by Adam Smith, who we consider the founder of modern economics, with his magnum opus, his great text, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. He has some very interesting and pertinent observations about the events that I've described, and I'd like to share them with you. So what Adam Smith wrote is nothing less than the following. The discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the 2 greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Now, this is a very clever person saying this, and he's saying that these 2 events are the most important events in the history of mankind, written in 1776. He says their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period between 2 and 3 centuries which has elapsed, and remember it was 278 years after da Gama's voyage that Adam Smith penned these lines. Between 2 and 3 centuries which have elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. What benefits or what misfortunes to mankind may hereafter result from those great events, no human wisdom can foresee. Now listen to what Adam Smith says. By uniting in some measure the most distant parts of the world, by enabling them to relieve one another's wants, to increase one another's enjoyments, and to encourage one another's industry, their general tendency would seem to be beneficial. In other words, unite the world in trade. Then we get all of the wonderful new products that come from different parts of the world. We have potatoes, we have maize, we have tomatoes, we have cocoa coming from the Americas, which we never would have had without these discoveries. And this is what Smith is saying. The world has enlarged, and now different parts of the world can help to meet the needs or the enjoyments of other parts of the world. But listen to the wisdom of this Scottish Enlightenment leader. He says the general tendency would seem to be beneficial, but to the natives, however, both of the East and West Indies, all of the commercial benefits which can have resulted from these events have been sunk and lost in the dreadful misfortunes which they have occasioned. In other words, it didn't increase the enjoyments of all parts of the world. The natives, the indigenous populations, were sunk into deep misfortune, says Adam Smith. These misfortunes, however, seem to have arisen rather from accident than from anything in the nature of the events themselves. In other words, it's not intrinsic to discovery or to connectedness that these disasters happen. It was an accident. What is the accident? At the particular time when these discoveries were made, the superiority of force happened to be so great on the side of the Europeans that they were enabled to commit with impunity every sort of injustice in those remote countries. And then he says, hereafter, perhaps the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all of the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some kind of respect for the rights of one another. He's saying someday in the future, writing in 1776, the poor countries will rise in power so that they can meet the rich and say no more injustice. And he says nothing seems more likely to establish that equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce, that is trade, from all countries to all countries, naturally or rather necessarily carries along with it. What is Smith saying? Smith is saying the most important events in the history of mankind was uniting humanity. But at the moment that humanity was united, Europe had the power, and the native inhabitants, the indigenous populations of the Americas, were sunk into deep misfortune. But then Smith, being the humanist that he is, says someday there will be equality. And how? Because all parts of the world will gain the knowledge of improvement, of well-being, of technology, so that there will be mutual awe, equality of force, and therefore mutual respect for all parts of the world. I have always found that a stunning vision of decency. Here was Adam Smith writing as the British Empire was gaining global power. And instead of glorying in the global power of Britain's might, he said, no, we want a world of equality, of decency, and of mutual respect. That's the kind of globalization that we seek.